Right. As we continue to have some folks joining us, let me just start by welcoming everyone to the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics and our seminar today on professionalism and the future of medicine. What role does the healthcare delivery organization play? So I'm Kelsey Berry, I'll be your moderator today, and I'm a faculty member here at the Center for Bioethics. Let me bring you straight into the session we have planned for you today. So we know professionalism is the basis of medicine's contract with society. And traditionally, medical professionalism has been understood as concerning the professional conduct and character of individual physicians. However, we also know that physicians train and practice in healthcare organizations and systems that powerfully shape the practice of medicine for better and worse. So how does the healthcare organization impact medical professionalism, and how should it operate in relation to medical professionalism? And what might it mean to involve the healthcare organization itself in expectations of professionalism? So we're glad to have Fred Hafferty with us today to discuss the emerging concept of organizational professionalism and the future of medicine. Fred is a senior fellow at the new Center for Professionalism and the Future of Medicine at the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, or ACGME for short. Fred is a medical sociologist, one of those disciplines that tends to help inform bioethics a little more about the world and the spaces that it hopes to engage in. He is professor emeritus at Mayo Clinic and the University of Minnesota, and an adjunct professor in the Department of Neurology at Yale School of Medicine. He chaired the medical sociology section of the American Sociological Association and currently sits on the American Board of Medical Specialties Standing Committee on Ethics and Professionalism and on the editorial board of Academic Medicine. So Fred has written numerous books and articles, far too many to mention here, but you might know him in particular as the person who I think somewhat famously introduced the term hidden curriculum into medical education. His research interests revolve around medical education's hidden curriculum, the evolution of medicine's professionalism movement, issues of medical socialization and organizational culture, the application of complexity theory and social network analysis to medical training, and disability studies. So I'm just about to turn it over to Ed, but I also wanted to briefly welcome our two excellent discussants who have joined us today, Ed Hundert and Lauren Taylor. Ed is Associate Director of the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, and he also served as Dean for Medical Education at Harvard from 2014 to 2023. My understanding is that Ed and Fred go way back, perhaps owing to their shared interest in the hidden curriculum in medical education. So we're really glad to have Ed here today and to have an occasion to put the two of them together again. And then Lauren is joining us from NYU, where she's a management scholar, an ethicist, and an assistant professor at the Grossman School of Medicine. Lauren and Fred have been exchanging ideas on organizations, professionalism, and ethics this year. And so we're glad to enable that exchange to continue in some part today. So thanks, Ed and Lauren, for being with us. With that, let me just mention a few quick housekeeping items. First of all, today is an interactive presentation. And so you're going to have to give us and yourselves the grace of figuring out how to interact. There might be some moments where we're switching screens in which you need to offer us a little bit of patience, but I promise you that it will pay off in the end. Furthermore, we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A today after we hear from Fred and a few reflections from Ed and Lauren. So if you would, please put your questions in the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom screen so that we can surface them for you all later. And then I'll also mention that the chat is open to you all if you want to share observations or comments throughout. I'd love for you to put your questions in the Q&A though, so that we have them coming into one place. And again, if you are running into kind of technical difficulties or errors, You can also use the chat to flag that up to us, and we'll do the best that we can. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fred and Nathaniel as well, I think, who will bring us into the interactive components of today's lecture.
Thank you, Kelsey, for that actually quite remarkable introduction. You've taken me back, particularly with Ed Hundert, to where we first met on Cape Cod. But first, Nathaniel, if you want to orient everybody to the QR code.
Hey, everybody. We're going to use Mentimeter today to try to be a little more interactive. So you can see a QR code on your screen. If you want to use your cell phone, that will pull you into our Menti group for this chat or for this presentation. The QR code will also come up as we're using it. So if you miss it, don't worry. But if you want to get it ahead, if you're a little worried about the technology, please go ahead and use that QR code to get that loaded up. Back to you, Fred.
Okay, thanks. And if Nathaniel, you can throw up, good. As Kelsey mentioned, this is the original title that we had talked about in preparation for today's session. And as I began work, I wound up framing and reframing my thoughts around this particular challenge. Nathaniel, next slide, please. And so we wound up going, this was my second order session title, now down to the third one, which is the one that I organized everything around for today. So we're going to be starting out with a bit of sociology and then moving into the general concepts of organizational professionalism. I would like to, before doing anything else, extend my appreciations. I want to thank Lauren Taylor for initially suggesting that I might have something useful and fun to talk about with you today. To Kelsey for some absolutely wonderful pre-session conversations that really push my thinking about today's topic. And finally, to Nathaniel Williams, who's both the technical whiz and the invisible hand behind everything that is going on today with respect to not only the slides, but the exercises and helping me think on these and related topics. In my comments today, I want to highlight three conceptual frames. They're going to be organizational professionalism, institutional logic, and organizational culture. And we'll talk about and link all three concepts. And in doing so, I want to begin with a disclaimer. As Kelsey mentioned, I'm a medical sociologist by training, and as a sociologist, I spend a good deal of my time thinking about things through the lens of social settings, social practices, social structures, and social relations, all of which shape how I think about issues of medical education and the training of future professionals. And right away, I want to pause and comment on what I just said, issues of medical education and the training of future professionals. When my dad went to medical school almost 90 years ago now, there was little tension between the medical school and practice. His 4 years of undergrad medical education at Tufts was followed by an internship here at the VA in West Roxbury, followed by a practice as a general practitioner, pre-family medicine in Everett, Massachusetts, where he was born and grew up, and then over into nearby Charlestown. So his medical world was a very local one, and everything I just mentioned is within a few miles of each other. The clinical system he trained in was basically the same system he went to work within. His hospital practice was at the Whidden in Everett. Clinics and hospitals were local and small. Even the academic medical centers of the day were a shadow of what they become today. Here's a picture I found while preparing this talk, the physician staff at the Whidden, date is 1960. And yeah, my dad is in the picture on the left under the painting. And I was able to identify the only woman in the picture with the help of my father's nurse's oldest daughter, Beth. The woman physician on the right is Dr. Livia Hedda Rev Curry. She's a clinical pathologist and an Auschwitz survivor. So today, in contrast to the world of my father, change is ubiquitous. It's calamitous, it's unrelenting, it's unsettling. The Mayo Clinic I joined in 2008 was not the Mayo Clinic I exited when I retired 14 years later. Not worse, not better, just different. And so nonetheless, and within the broad context of change, there is this social fact that all of this change is taking place within social settings, which involve social actors and social groups, which requires, for me at least, to treat context as immensely consequential, both as a frame within which social action takes place, but also as a contributing factor to that action. In short, context matters. Another sociological truism I want to emphasize today is in terms of the everyday social, where context often is taken for granted by participants and thus rendering it invisible to those participants. And this general frame includes the everyday practices and routines of medicine and medical education. This social fact is one of sociology's main challenges, to take what is taken for granted and hold it up to some critical scrutiny and potentially make the taken for granted visible. And this is one of the reasons why I've spent at least part of my career talking about the hidden curriculum of medical education, including, and here today, how we might think about organizations and professionalism. Relatedly, culture matters. And what do I mean by culture? For the purposes of our time together, I'm going to define culture as the way we do things around here. And I'm not being glib. There are academic articles and books using this definition as a frame, such as the book on organizational culture in the lower right corner of the slide. But I don't want to rush by the definition. The way. Think shared social practices. We, a very powerful word. Think shared identity. Not them, not me, but we. Do things. What are the things being done in the particular ways that in turn give the we its collective nature around here? And thus place and context, where around here certainly sounds more local than global. Finally, who's making the claim? Is it a collective we, a true us, or is it the powers to be talking, the C-suite? Is it a pronouncement or something more organic? And what about newcomers? Are newcomers already substantively like the insiders, or is the we becoming more heterogeneous? With all of the above being captured, at least for me, in this quote from one of the high priests of classical sociology, Peter Berger, along with my slightly altered corollary, and where this reference to daily life includes the routines of medical education and medical practice. In short, anytime you hear someone say what needs to change is, think two things. The change levers usually are much more complex than what usually a singular thing is being shouted out, and two, why this particular avenue of change and why these levers? Who gets the call for change and how do they benefit? So, how do I see the remainder of our time? Using this aforementioned sociological base, we're going to continue to explore conceptually and interactively issues of professionalism within an organizational context, and we're going to do this exploration via the group exercises and hence the QR code at the beginning, and it'll pop up as we go forward. And most of all, I hope we have fun. My email address is on the first slide. It'll be on the last one, and I welcome any questions, comments, or criticisms if you want to contact me later. So let's start with some fun. Since a key player in today's session is the organization, or organizations plural. Please go to the first question listed in following your QR code. And where you will see when you get there a line as depicted on the slide. And where the left end of the line is marked HNS-RIM and the right SAITOR. And where the anchoring question prompt is organizations. So left end, HNS-RIM. Organizations have no social reality independent of their members. Whether bricks and mortar or virtual, organizations are best conceptualized as social entities made up of individuals and their conversations, interactions, behaviors. Organizations are nothing more than the sum of these parts. And that end of the line is your absolute end. On the right end, SAITOR, organizations are social actors in their own right. Organizations are independent social entities. They behave and act with agency and are not reducible to any sum of their parts. Again, that end of the line as an absolute. How do you view organizations? Place your dot anywhere on the line as you see this.
And again, those who are coming to it, there's that QR code for you in the bottom. You can still use it. We should start seeing all these wonderful dots pop up on our line.
Yeah, and please participate. This is a great opportunity for you to explore and then get to see how others view this issue.
Fred, could you give us a quick summary once again of the two polls on the?
Oh, sure. The left end is HNS-RIM. Organizations have no social reality independent of their members. So whether bricks and mortar or virtual, organizations are best conceptualized as being made up of individuals and their conversations, interactions, behaviors. Organizations are nothing more than the sum of the parts. That's all the way to the left. All the way to the right, SAITOR, organizations are social actors in their own right. They're independent, they behave and act with agency and not reducible to the sum of the parts. How do you view things?
And so again, for some people, both the website and the code is posted in the chat. It's located on top as well. And I will bring up the QR code one more time. It looks like we already have 30 respondents, which is great.
Thank you.
If we could view more, that would be wonderful.
And as we're waiting for those few more, I'm just going to say thank you, thank you, thank you. You're a sociologist delight, meaning you don't all agree. There are people in the group who view organizations quite differently from each other, and maybe we will have an opportunity to explore those differences as we talk about organizations and professionalism.
So I think, Fred, that's probably about the responses we're going to get for this one.
Okay. All right. Why don't we move then, Nathaniel? So if you all want to, sort of fix that image in your mind, and we can go on to the next slide. Here are two results that we can use as points of comparison. The one on the left is from a session with medical education leaders, meaning deans, CEOs, foundation heads. Same question. We've lost it, Nathaniel.
Sorry, can you guys see that, everybody?
Well, we can see the two slides or the two images, but also the results of
I
our own
added your
exercise.
results
Good.
for you, Fred. So sorry to make a
Thanks.
quick change.
No, no, no. This is great. So the one on, again, the upper left is the a session from medical education leaders, deans, CEOs, foundation heads, same question, the same line anchors. And the one on the right, slightly different anchors and a slightly different question, but essentially the same issue. And in all three of our examples now, today as well, we have differences within the groups on the nature of organizations. And I think how one views organizations has fundamental implications. For example, the group on the left on how individuals lead their organizations. And the group on the right, which was more medical education researchers, the questions that they ask and the sources of data they draw upon as they do their scholarly work. Next, I want to move to the topic of professionalism and begin this part of my comments by taking you on a 300-second dash through medicine's modern-day professionalism movement. I say modern day because when I was introduced to the concept of professionalism as a graduate student in the 1970s within the context of sociology and the frame of medicine, it was within the frame of medicine as a profession. And at that time, and within sociology, there were vigorous debates about whether medicine was maintaining its traditional powers and privileges, or whether it was becoming deprofessionalized, proletarianized, or corporatized. These are all three different theoretical perspectives using different variables and different data sets. And for me, medicine's modern-day professionalism movement began to surface in the 1990s, and as we will see, with its different emphasis than what existed in sociology. And I say movement because professionalism is a dynamic social process. The professionalism of today is not that of yesterday nor tomorrow. I mean, who would have thought, I didn't, that now 30-ish years into the movement that the P word would have become hotly contested, seen as laden with negative connotations, and with some calling for its banishment as a legacy of privilege and the social reproduction of power structures. Here's one such representation from about 15 years ago from Daniel Wolfson, then the director of the ABIM Foundation. While I prefer the frame of waves rather than stages, I'm touched that Daniel drew upon the Moving Beyond Nostalgia article written with Dana Levinson. Here's a second slide, again by Wolfson, this time characterizing that there's not just one professionalism. Here he's capturing the tension between the classical sociological framing of profession, with medicine being viewed as a self-interested and self-promoting monopoly, versus a rendering preferred by medicine, where professionalism is viewed more as inspirational and aspirational. Another way to view the movement is via timeline. This particular view, as a partial view, is a timeline that was compiled by myself and professionalism colleagues and populated with key publications, conferences, organizational changes, all associated with this movement. And as you might expect and partially captured in Daniel Wolfson's figure, the earliest folks I were called to define, then assess, and then to operationalize or routinize professionalism within medicine and medical schools via the development of curricula, competency, codes, and charters. Lots of C words. Although what I'm about to say is a gross simplification, there were and probably always will be power dynamics at play, as many of the early efforts to institutionalize professionalism, particularly within the learning environments of medical education, focused on students, with faculty actively resisting early on any calls, whether by students or others, that they too needed to improve their professionalism. For my purposes, and I think there are good sociological explanations here, the concept of organizational professionalism, along with early calls to remediate unprofessionalism, were somewhat later arrivals in the movement, both around 2010, 2012. And while both resided on somewhat different professionalism shores, both affirmed and thus reaffirmed a central precept in the movement that professionalism issues were best imagined and operationalized at the individual level. Thus, remediation is almost exclusively focused on the remediation of individuals. There may be toxic environments out there in medical practice or learning lands, but what is being sent for remediation are individuals, not programs or organizations. Ditto for organizational professionalism, where the concept primarily was framed as a calling upon organizations and organizational leadership to create practice environments that would promote the professionalism of its clinicians. We'll be exploring this framing, something I'll term today as inward-facing organizational professionalism, and something I also see, given its focus on physicians, as continuing to view the individual as its primary unit of analysis. So what are we talking about when we use the concept of organizational professionalism? The concept itself exists within two organizational research literatures. One's US-facing, largely focusing on medicine and largely on issues at the level of the individual. The second is more European-based. It exists within a broader literature that includes both medicine but also other occupational sectors, and within a tradition that has long differentiated between things like organizational professionalism, say the professionalism of doctors or other occupational professionalism, the focusing on the professionalism of doctors or other occupational groups, and organizational professionalism, and thus within a more macro societal and social institutional framework, including that of institutional logic. Taken together, I've begun to think of this inward versus outward facing organizational professionalism, where with respect to the inward, the focus is on how organizations can structure their learning and work environments to promote and not retard the professionalism of its workforce. Fantastic. As a conceptual frame, this is in line with a general body of work on organizational behavior, conditions of work that incentivize certain behaviors or individuals and de-incentivize others. Alternatively, outward-facing professionalism locates organizations within broader social forces and norms and works alongside concepts such as organizational fields, institutional logic, and neo-institutionalism. So to illustrate, here are some inward US-facing organizational professionalism articles, and there are individuals like Barry Edgener, who's been a prominent voice in this literature. And here are some articles that are more European and more focusing on occupational sectors outside of medicine. And thus back to our old friend Context Matters, along with its relational compadre, the unit of analysis. Are we talking about individuals or something more of a collective nature? And so what about organizations? Are they independent social creatures? Do they operate as independent entities or isolated islands? I don't think so. Which brings me then to the frames of institutional level analysis, institutional logic, and related concepts like organizational fields and neo-institutional theory. And thus, how might we imagine organizations as functioning within networks of influence, and thus begin to think about outward-facing organizational professionalism, where we begin to bump into related sociological concepts of social institutions, which are macro-level factors, versus organizations which are seen within sociology as meso-level factors. For sociologists, Mayo Clinic, for example, is not an institution. It's an organization. And part of the conceptual problem, at least for me and within medicine, is that when folks call a hospital or a clinic or even a healthcare system as an institution, this labeling short circuits the conversation at an organizational level and thus helps to blind folks to still broader institutional level factors. So yes, I do cringe when I hear somebody refer to their workplace as, oh, here's what happens at my institution. No, it's their organization. So what are we talking about when we use the term institutional logic? So here's my definitional slide. Institutional logics are, they're socially constructed, historically developed patterns of beliefs and rules that shape the organizing principles of an institution and do so in providing what? A set of norms for an organization and for the individuals who work therein. And by the way, while we're reading, check out the spelling of organization. This does not come from a US-facing publication. So whatever the logic particulars, when we're talking about logics, we're talking about the underlying values and norms that drive what and why we do what we do. And in keeping with a hidden curriculum focus, we need to at least be moderately mindful about the possible differences between the stated purpose versus the purpose in action. Medical schools may insist that their purpose is to train future physicians in service to the public, but how they carry out that stated mission may be at odds with this general public service claim. Meanwhile, large health service systems, whether they say so directly or not, may be looking for more highly trained physician technicians who will easily fit within the system and where they can be generically referred to and viewed as quote unquote providers. Bottom line, organizations are complex social creatures and they rarely speak with one voice. All of which brings us to our next exercise. This time, we're going to be using a triangle rather than a line. And this is going to be our most relational exercise, where the B stands for bureaucratic forces, where the M for market forces, and the P for professionalism as a social force. And to set up the exercise, before you do any trying to answer, I want to take you back into sociology, and in this case, the work of Elliot Friedson. There are some of his books, including the first two, which are on the left. They were published in 1970, and they formed my early introduction to the sociology of profession. And the book on the right, his last publication, which was in 2001. In the 2001 book, Friedson organized his arguments around three institutional level logics, which he saw as having countervailing properties: the logic of the marketplace, the logic of bureaucracy, and the logic of professionalism. And he did so in terms of three ways of organizing work. And that's a predominant frame within sociology for thinking about professions and professionalism, where the marketplace is where consumers are in command, bureaucracies where managers dominate, and professionalism where specialized workers control their own work. And none of these three logic and their particular organizational appearances are necessarily bad, nor should they be stricken from the workplace. But Friedson did see some inherent tensions among the three, particularly between professionalism and the other two. Now, depending on the country, there may be other logics at work, be they political or perhaps governmental, and at least in the US today, everything seems to be politicized. But finally, and perhaps most important for me, Friedson conceptualizes professionalism not so much as individual physicians doing the right thing, quote unquote, or some compliance version of acting in the right way, but rather as a way of organizing work. There are others who have used the logics framework. Cruz and colleagues identify a fourth logic, care, in addition to Friedson's three, in order to differentiate for them between for-profit and not-for-profit healthcare settings. Rook and Tobert, in their long-term study of leadership, identify 7 logics of leadership, and thus take us from Frideson's way of organizing work to their way of leading. There are others, including those that focusing on healthcare. My favorite is the Varpio et al. 2017 paper with an authorship list that's incredible. Some of my all-time favorite people to work with and learn from, and from which I took the definition I just shared a couple of slides ago. Which brings us to the long-promised question. Using a countervailing logics framework, this time with the triangle to represent for today the 3 logics, and calling again for a gut level, a kind of lightning type response. So here's our question, how do these 3 logics play out within your medical health science school and or their related clinical learning environments? Remembering our vertices, the top of the triangle B is bureaucratic, the bottom left is M for market, and the bottom right is for professionalism. If you were to see all 3 as being equally impactful, you'd place your dot, your pin, in the middle of the triangle. If you thought that the market rules all, and that bureaucratic and professional logic have absolutely no sway, you'd place your X tight in the left lower corner. If you saw that bureaucratic and professional dominated equally, but with the market having no impact, you'd place your pin halfway between B and P on the right side of the triangle, where, since that pin drop was as far removed as possible from the bottom left corner, you would be saying that market forces have no sway. So please mark your triangle. And the question, how do these 3 logics play out within your medical health science school and or its related clinical learning environments?
Okay, and I hope everybody's seeing a triangle that's adding little dots one after another after
another. There are
So
no wrong answers here. So
yep.
Just
Last time we had about 30 responses. Looks like I have 20 right now. Again, that QR code is in the corner. Again, if you want to participate, we love to see where you are on this triangle.
And the more pin drops that are there, the more you can locate where you dropped your pin relative to your colleagues. And again, the question, how do these 3 logics play out within your medical health science school and or its related clinical learning environments?
Okay, Fred, any comments on this before I take it down and get slides up?
Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a second that will be rooted in context. But what I'm seeing is a distribution that kind of skews to the left, a bit more in the market direction, or an interplay. The dots at the bottom would be an interplay of markets and professionalism with those pin drops saying that bureaucracy, managerialism has virtually no impact on how things are unfolding within that particular health science school and or its related clinical learning environments. Why don't we go on to an example? Okay. What you have here, similar exercise, this time done paper and pencil, which is the aggregate on the upper left, and then I just reproduce things in a word processor. 2 summers ago, did a similar exercise, an in-person conference in Scotland, where the attendees, all physicians, were asked to draw their own triangle on a Post-it note and they were, as I said, physician educators from the UK, and based on place directs, same question within the relative weight of these three logics in terms of how they were playing out in their own educational training environments. And the results for me made a lot of sense from a UK perspective, given that all of them worked within the NHS. You can note the dominance of the X's at the top of the triangle, and thus the bureaucratic managerial vertex. Can we go back just for a second? I'm just reflecting after the presentation. One of the two X's on the bottom right corner came up to me, and actually it's somebody a lot of you know, and just said, that's one of my X's, but I'm Canadian. And in any event, okay, let's move on. So one more exercise before we get to our discussions, this time back to the concept of organizational professionalism, and in particular the inward-facing view of organizational professionalism. Let's say that we have such an organization, Harvard, wherever, that went forth your place of work. Let's make it the reference point being the same frame where you answered the previous question. And it went full bore and created an organizational setting that maximized the ability of its clinicians to be professional. And so the reference point would be where you placed your pin on the last question. Now you have a different state of affairs. Optimum professionalism in a clinical work environment. Next slide. What would that optimal organizational professionalism look like? How would it change for you? But remembering that part of this exercise, you're operating within an organizational setting populated with countervailing logic. So if you're going to move your pin more towards the P vertex, the move has to come from somewhere. It's got to stress either or both the market and the managerial logics. So as you move the pin and or not, answer for yourselves, and maybe we can talk about this during the discussion. Where are you getting your play, if you will, from? But also, as you're answering this question, and I'm looking at your answers, and I don't want to bias anybody who hasn't responded yet. I mean, we're getting one response that says that this optimal organizational professional environment really does maximize professionalism. We got a dot down there in the corner. This maximal environment for others, some movement, but not as much, and still the tension here now, and we'll get both as Nathaniel is capturing the images. We'll get both images up in a second. It looks like the movement is coming from lessening the effect of markets, where the bureaucratic didn't have much of an effect to begin with. And I'd love to find out why you think that way. Before Nathaniel puts up both sets of results, I just have a couple of closing comments before we move to the discussants and to a general discussion. I wanted to Can Sue put up the closing thoughts, or it's fine? It's just a slide that says closing thoughts, and it doesn't need to be up there. The concept of organizational professionalism is a late arrival to U.S. medicine's modern day professionalism movement. And for me, with that arrival about a decade ago, its conceptualization and operationalization in the U.S. largely has reflected the prevailing cultural ethic within American medicine, and that's at the level of the individual. Even when we talk about organizations or conceptual siblings like systems, they're conceptualized as promoting the professionalism of individuals or employees. We see a similar tendency in conceptual framings when we talk about things like burnout or mistreatment or well-being, a slight sidestep, but we have a similar story when we talk about professional identity formation. Here too, we almost exclusively talk about the professional identity formation of individuals. But what about the identity and related identity formation of an organization or a medical specialty? Or for me, the most important question, what about the future of medicine as a profession? Which is a question that takes me back to the 1970s when I was introduced to all of this. But while I believe it's important to think about how organizational entities such as healthcare turn their eye towards creating work environments that promote the professionalism of its workforce, and be mindful of the fact that the professionalism physicians see is not the same professionalism as seen by nurses or nurse practitioners or physician assistants, etc. We need to be mindful that there are other logics at work within these organizational settings. And these are not trivial normative or value-based logics. When leaders claim, and I've heard this directly, and maybe you have, that we need to keep the lights on and the doors open in order to do the good patient-centered work we do, this is a claim that mission is a second-order consideration to that of margin, that mission is dependent of a margin, and thus we have a not so insignificant elevation of market margin logic over that of patient-centered professionalism logic. Finally, I think we need in the U.S. to imagine organizations as functioning within broader social networks, which include, but not limited to, networks of organizations operating within the same organizational field. If an organization wants to join the organization professionalism bandwagon, fantastic. But I don't think it's going to do so as a solo flyer. And thus, and contrary to what I've been told, that the operational strategy for advancing organizational professionalism needs to unfold one organization at a time. Nathaniel has worked his magic. And maybe just leaving, if it's okay, I'll tell you what, Nathaniel, if you could go to the last slide and then come back to this slide, and we can go back over to the discussants. I did want to thank everybody for your kind attention and the participation with the exercises as we turn things over to the two individuals, Ed Hundert and Lauren Taylor, that are much smarter people than I. But I want to leave you with a final reflection that we all function within social milieus, including organizations, that are awash with disconnects and cross-messaging. And how and why we choose to favor one message over others is what makes social life fascinating for sociologists like me. Thank you. Can we go back and put the slide up?
Yes, give me 1 second, Fred.
Okay, but
There, can we see it?
yes.
Yes.
So we've got movement. And maybe it will be fun to talk about why the movement is limited and how that movement took place. What did we take it away from? How do we diminish? Well, we have two forces. The bureaucratic managerialism and then the market down there on the left. They can lessen their influence, or we can in turn reinforce the professionalism side and pull those circles to the right. But in any event, Kelsey, do you want to just take it away from Nathaniel and I and turn it over to the big thinkers?
Thank you so much, Fred. I got a few private messages already saying, oh my goodness, this is so many new concepts that I haven't yet had an opportunity to work with in my own work. So I want to hear from Lauren. I want to hear from Ed. I do want to say this is so in kind of common intent with, I think, some of the work that we've done in seminars of this nature previously, where we thinking about kind of the meso level of American healthcare that's comprised of, a lot of organizations that I admit I think of as actors and more so simply than the sum of their parts. But to really ask questions when we think, kind of broadly about ethics and organizations as to how they look inward. That is to say, how your healthcare system, healthcare organization considers its internal culture and what it's doing with respect to the population that it serves and the workers inside. And then also very much how it looks outward. How does it see its role with respect to some of the institutional norms, with respect to macro level policies? And so I love how you were able to frame for us this kind of inward looking and outward looking or organizational field kind of frame on what an organization might attend to when it's attempting to bring forth norms of professionalism. All right, I'm not the discussant. So I'm just the chair of the series. So let me go to Lauren maybe to begin with. And then we'll turn it maybe back to Fred if you want to chat for a second and go over to Ed. Lauren, please jump in.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. And Ed, I'm looking at you and saying, oh, I should have made you go first. Fred, that was a tour de force as usual. And I've had the privilege of hearing some of this in our back and forth and writing together.
Yeah.
So I have a head start, but let's see, I think I might have three things to say. One is, I think the implicit question on the table here is the idea of organizational professionalism useful?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, for solving what problem or to put to work to what end? And I would just say, to me, when we think about professionalism, typically we drop the organization. The idea of being a professional and the idea of making recourse to professionalism to say, Dr. Hafferty, what you've done is a violation of your professional obligations, is to say, like, your behavior is not in keeping with some sort of external standard that belongs to a profession or a guild. And so with that in mind, I think we could think about two different kinds of problems on the table. And I think organizational professionalism is a useful idea for one of them and not really for the other. So the first kind of problem is the one that is like residents or other people who work in healthcare delivery organizations feel burnt out, undermined, and just generally not supported by the kind of culture of the places that they work. And this concern is sort of one that says, organizations, healthcare delivery organizations need to be better about not undermining the professional values of the people who work in them. So if I'm a physician and I took a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, and I feel that my organization in some way forces my hand to do harm by denying patients insurance and therefore they can't get care from me or whatever it may be, that's a place where I think organizational professionalism could be a useful idea, because we could say, like, look, organizational professionalism is that inward gaze concept that you presented. It means to be an organizational professional means to not undermine the professionalism of the individuals inside your org. And I think there's some value there because it links the behavior of individuals and the organizations, and therefore the context in which they operate. People know what professionalism means, particularly for doctors, nurses, other clinicians. And so there's sort of value to hooking the organization's responsibilities to the idea of professionalism there. The second problem would be to say, is more the kind of problem that I think about in my day-to-day life, since I'm not a clinician and I don't work every day in a hospital, which is about healthcare delivery organizations' behavior in, for lack of a better word, the marketplace, or their interactions with communities. And here, this is the concern about kind of no margin, no mission. Like, organizations are rapacious contractors. They're extractive to the communities in which they operate. They sort of lie to the publics that they are meant to serve. And here the question is, like, does organizational professionalism as a term or a concept give us valuable leverage on that set of problems, or does it help us to create new standards? And I think the challenge I have here, which is also a problem in the first case, but I'm willing to overlook it, is just this issue of, like, what is the reference? What is the organizational field? You know, if I say, like, Dr. Hafferty, you're a physician and what you've done is incompatible with the standards of being a medical professional. Well, ABIMF and the Hippocratic Oath and the AMA have all enunciated pretty clearly, like, what those standards are, and the field in reference is obvious. But if, like, Mass General Brigham does something I don't like, it's not clear to me what the reference field is to say, like, Mass General Brigham, you have misbehaved. You've not done what the field expects or has enunciated as a normative obligation. And lacking that, I just don't know that professionalism is a term that gets us a ton of mileage, or why we would try and, like, kind of pigeonhole ourselves into this idea of organizational professionalism as the term of art or the kind of key concept. So what constructively could I offer? I mean, I don't know what the better term is, but I think, like, on first pass, something like organizational integrity strikes me as a more useful idea, because to think about organizational integrity would mean, like, integrity connotes a sense of wholeness or consistency, internal and external. But it doesn't have this idea that professionalism has, which is making reference to an externally imposed standard. So if I were to try and evaluate the organizational integrity of a healthcare delivery organization, rather than looking around and trying to figure out what's the relevant field and what has that field put forth by way of edicts, I would instead say, like, what values or standards has the organization announced for itself? Does it say it cares about health equity? Does it say that it cares about racial justice? Does it say it cares about quality? And then I would look at the organization's behaviors, both kind of in the marketplace, where the organization is signing contracts and engaged in negotiations and strategically putting up new brick and mortar clinics and shutting down others. And I think I could look internally as well. And I could say, like, what kind of incentive packages does it offer employees? What kind of dashboards does it set up to try and draw attention to certain kinds of performance and away from others? And then the question would be, like, how consistently do those things hang together? That gets us out of the concern about what's the field and what are the standards. It requires introducing a new term where organizational professionalism allows us, as you said, there's been a movement already. It allows us to kind of hook a new set of concerns and writing, et cetera, to an already moving train. And that's a trade-off. but I do think it strikes me as a cleaner fit with the organizational realities that we have in healthcare delivery today. Fred, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I like it. I like it in part because I think I like going from professionalism to integrity because of two issues. The one that you mentioned descriptively, and that is the potential for tension in that interstitial space between the organization facing outward to the community and doing what it does in that direction. You had some great words that you used there, where I wound up saying, how is it possible for an organization to promote professionalism from within if it's doing that outwardly? That's nuts.
Right.
It sounds like a Jekyll and Hyde. Maybe we can rewrite that story using that frame. So that's the integrity part. The professionalism part is, and I'm going to say something that may get me in trouble because I'm not being fair, is the potential, I'll put it that way, potential shallowness of the organizational professionalism frame in terms of who says, oh, is this about organizations maximizing the professionalism of its clinical workforce? Let's just say doctors for the sake of, according to whom? The doctors? Oh, are they going to be the only ones that get to say what it means to be a professional because they have these external frames that they're going to use? I don't think so. I think, among others, the managerial side of things has some quite specific ideas about what it means to be a good doctor. And so the frame of professionalism isn't going to be unchallenged within that space of creating work environments where workers can be more professional, according to who. So those two, I mean, we're going to talk more. So thank you for that.
Bring in Ed on this. Oh, it doesn't have to be actually on this in particular, but Ed, did you want to follow this thread or bring in something new?
Well, I might do a little bit of both. Thanks. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And I really want to thank Fred for his important and influential work over many, many years. He was referencing the fact that it was in the mid-1990s that we probably did our first panel together on professionalism and these issues. And it's sort of funny, Fred. I remember that I think it was at this AAMC conference on the moral development of students and residents in
Oh, yes.
1995 that we had our first discussion of whether the term the hidden curriculum is really the best term. We realized what the origins of it were, but it has this wonderful quality that it implies that the CEO of the hospital and the dean of the med school don't know that this is going on, like it's hidden from somebody. And actually, they spend all their day talking about this same issue all the time. And so, it's sort of the lived experience of people, not that it's just that it's not the formal curriculum, it's the, lived curriculum. And it's relevant to the question we're talking about, because in your wonderful, you put up a slide briefly that had this historical review of like how we've thought about this issue over time. And it started from this very individual and non-institutional thing about individual values and behaviors, right? And, when you take that limited view, there's always been this kind of nihilistic idea. Well, this is really just for like med school admissions committees, admit people with the right values. And, if you stopped admitting all these psychopaths or something, and, we know that it's not just that, right? And probably people don't agree on almost anything in medical education except one thing, which is the 4 years of medical school can take altruistic, other-oriented people and turn them into bitter cynics in 4 short years if you don't do it right. And so, I would say, what do we learn from that? Whatever the neurobiological structures are that pin these values are still plastic in adult life to be influenced. And so we should take that as a form of optimism that if we put them into the right kind of professional and moral milieu, that we can reinforce the values that brought them to medicine and to nursing and these other fields, or at least do no harm, if not even help set a higher and higher bar. So I guess, if I go back to that first index card exercise, and think about, are we thinking more about people in the institutions or kind of institutions as actors in themselves? Well, I think both perspectives have some truth. I'm more on the left side of that thing because I'm coming from the notion that institutions don't actually make decisions and do things in the way the people make decisions and do things, particularly the leaders of those institutions. So, and this comes perhaps from my previous experience as dean of a medical school that that owned its own health system, and I tend to view the institutional structures, which the buildings, the founding documents, the bylaws, whatever it is, mostly, although they have mission statements and things that are published, they mostly don't have a point of view on the key practical moral issues of the day that create that moral milieu in which our clinicians and our staff and our students and our residents and our patients get educated and get cared for and so forth. So, for example, to take today's very active issues, whether a health system is actively resisting the pressures that exist now to withdraw the care of trans patients or eliminate their DEI initiatives or whatever, I would say right now we see some health systems that are capitulating to those pressures and compromising some of those core values, and others that are continuing, at least so far, to resist those pressures in the name of the professional duties and values. And that doesn't actually break down by red states, blue states, or by for-profit, not-for-profit, or by academic centers and community centers. It actually breaks down by the leaders of those systems and how they're creating the kind of moral milieu that they think is worthy of their institution. So, I love the fact that you ended, both of you actually brought in the margin mission, thing that people talk about. Because now, when I interact with health system leaders, every single time, I always like to remind them that don't worry, I know I'm an academic, but I get no margin, no mission. I really get no margin, no mission. But there's this other thing I really want them to think about, and that is no mission, no mission. That if you have to actually start with the power of moral leadership. And, for me, there is this, overarching reality that comes from the famous quote from Albert Schweitzer that by example is not a way people learn behavior, it's the only way. Right? By example is not a way people learn behavior, it's the only way. And so when the leaders are actually trying to set that high moral bar, it creates a kind of milieu that I think helps reinforce the professionalism at the individual level. And if you do want to talk about professionalism at the institutional level, that's probably 90% of what you're talking about. So I could talk a lot more, but let me stop there in the interest of getting everybody else into the act.
How can I not listen to Ed like listening to Lauren and not want to say something back? I'll make it very quick because I found myself in conversations like what you just said about first of all the nature of the organization. So that first exercise, and then out of that, for folks more on the left side of the continuum, you would have arguments about, you didn't say this literally, organizations don't make decisions, the leaders make decisions. And one of the things that I'm learning now at the ACGME, particularly as I talk with, the recently departed CEO, but now the head of the new Center for Professionalism and Future Medicine, Tom Naska, is the relationship of leadership and governance. And so I just came out, I'll just throw this out, Ed, for a future conversation for us, with a conversation with a board member, ACGME board member, and saying that, all right, with a new chair of the board, George Thibault, and a third of the board, quarter to a third of the board turning over, new members, do we have a new board? And the answer from a board member, a past board member, was no. Well, isn't the leadership and aren't the new members going to change the board? Who gets changed, or what gets changed? And I was brought up short, specifically with the concept of organizational culture. It was, put to me, Fred, don't you believe in organizational culture? In this case, the culture of the board. Does that have any sway over what new leadership and new members do? And the answer was yes. So, and I did get pulled up with, well, Fred, don't you believe in the hidden curriculum? There's a hidden curriculum in the board. There's a values built into how the board sees the way things are done around here. And new folks have to fit into that, and new leaders have to fit into that. So anyway,
Fred, when you mentioned in your wonderful talk the idea of professional identity formation of an institution.
Oh, I've been talking with Tom.
I really thought that was relevant to what you just brought up, because as someone who's tried to help some of the new medical schools get started, I was always trying to get them to try to be intentional about that. It's like, you're not an institution yet, and now you're going to have the chance to create this. And I would actually point them to this wonderful section in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Here he was, this European. He came to this country when it was sort of being formed, and he was absolutely dumbfounded. His big conclusion was, his visit here reminded him, and the quote is, that before social institutions are causes, they are effects. Like, this was a shock to him, that, because he assumed these institutions have been around forever, so they only cause things. But actually, there are people who cause them. And, what you're talking about is we're continually recausing them. And and we could do case studies. I'm sure like various business schools have these case studies of a very professionalized institution of a health system whose board members used to be a lot of people who sat on lots of nonprofit boards and were do-gooders and clinicians, and then over time they became a bunch of venture capitalists and private equity people, because they were the ones giving the big contributions and wanted their family to get VIP care or something. And the next thing you know, the pressures on the CEOs had completely changed, and the emphasis was more on the margin and less on the mission. And it was because of that change in the board. And so I'm a big believer that the governance makes all the difference. And you see it every day. And that might be, Lauren, another way of capturing what you were saying, is like, that's a notion of institutional professionalism. Like, maybe that looking at, like, if you interviewed each of those board members and said, where are you on that triangle that Fred put up? And if the board members are all down on the market side, how is the CEO and the chief of medicine supposed to be on the P side?
What would be really interesting is one of the critiques of integrity as a concept is, okay, if there's someone out there who says, I'm a nihilist, I don't care about anyone, and they live their life that way, do we say they have high integrity? Because there's a match between their statements and their behaviors. And so similarly, Ed, when you think about a board. Let's say, and I can see in the chat there's concern about sort of for-profit organizations in particular. If there were to be a for-profit healthcare delivery system, a board stacked with people who were primarily there for sort of managerial or business type reasons, and they said, look, we're here to make money. We'll maintain compliance with whatever kind of legal regulatory standards are, but otherwise we're mostly an extractive enterprise and we want to be straightforward about that. And then their behaviors largely matched that. You know, they said, we don't accept Medicaid and our charity care policy is really skimpy, et cetera, et cetera. We would have to say, I think, it's a high integrity organization. Now, it might also be an organization that systematically undermines the individual level professionalism of the clinicians in it. So that's where these ideas kind of part ways. Like that would be, on my account, high integrity, but undermining professionalism. And the question is whether or not we think that idea of integrity that could be applied in a case like that does enough work for us to be a valuable concept to kind of deploy and play with. I can live with that, but I know that some people would find that really unsatisfying.
May I jump in? I was actually, as Lauren, as you were talking about the concept of integrity, that it would involve in some sense, if we were to anchor on that concept at an organizational level, something of an abdication of looking for an external standard by which to evaluate organizations. You know, I think just empirically speaking, that doesn't capture our practices, right? So now you could say that more often than not, we're actually evaluating healthcare organizations according to the existing standard, which is, are they facilitating the professionalism of their workforce, of the carers and physicians within them. But I'm not so sure that that's the case. You know, I think there are a number of efforts to hold organizations, healthcare organizations in particular, to account beyond their kind of measuring whether those who are working within the organization are abiding by the standards of professionalism that are already offered. So I guess what I'm saying is I would regret giving up the search for an external standard by which to think about organizations, whether we call that professionalism or something else. I think that the external standard is something that in our everyday practices we are already looking for, and that might benefit from some critical thinking about what it ought to encompass, which goes beyond that kind of satisfaction of the internal idea of making sure everyone within is in line with the existing standards that they are held to.
Who or what do you think has provided an external standard, Kelsey?
I think a little bit about ratings organizations that are trying to put forth ideas of social responsibility in healthcare. You might think of the Lown Institute, for example. You know, that I think actually that's probably the biggest example that comes to mind right now. But I guess what I would want to do empirically is kind of crosswalk the different kind of metrics that they're using to evaluate organizations. Are those metrics implied by medical professionalism at an individual level already? In which case, then the external standard is simply making reference to our existing idea of the obligations, permissions, and rights of individual medical professionals. But I guess the other thing is the word professionalism, in my mind, implies a kind of privilege, right? If I abide by this external standard, then I get something out of it. I get to be seen as a professional. I get to be called a doctor. And what it means to be called a health organization, I think if we want to have some kind of a gatekeeping in that respect, then we would want there to be an avowed external standard. All right, now I've said a lot. Let me open it back up, whether Lauren or others want to jump in. Let me maybe raise one of them, which picks up on some of the marketization ways in which there's been a emphasis on market as an institutional logic. So this question comes from Ausubel, and he says, one of the prevailing concerns in his field is the increasing cost of healthcare. and how American providers are not fully trained on the financial needs that patients and their families must navigate, which often prevents those patients and families from seeking care. So how do you think about, I'm going to broaden this question a little bit, the future of medicine tackling those challenges, but then also whether you see some role for organizational professionalism as a component of addressing those challenges?
You know, I think, Kelsey, that, you know, maybe there's a fourth, maybe it needs to be a square rather than a triangle, with the notion of sort of risk aversion and fear of litigation and so forth as another countervailing force when you look at how decisions are made. Because I think a lot of people feel that the way that cost pressures have started to influence decision making in a way that might be eroding either the integrity or the professionalism of the institutions, depending upon how we want to define them, um, comes from the fact that there's a fear that if we do things that are new and innovative, it's different from what we've done and we bear certain risks. We recently had a conference on um, ethical issues in AI in medicine and the applications of AI in medicine. And there was somebody there from a health system where they had recently implemented an amazing AI system for all of the ICUs across their whole health system. And it turns out that the AI can detect when patients in the ICU are becoming septic hours before the first doctor or nurse notices subtle changes in their vital signs. And the implementation of this AI system saves lives. It improves the outcomes for a whole population. It saved money, right? You know, it's like the quadruple aims. You have almost all of them right there. And yet, so why hasn't every health system already adopted this when it's been shown? And when I asked the head of a health system, oh, we're looking at it, there's still worries about privacy of data, who owns the data, and there's blah, blah. And it's like patients in your hospital are dying unnecessarily while you're having academic discussions about that. Like, how is that okay? So to me, that's an example where if you went back to the mission and said, patients first, we're here to actually help the patients. And when we have these balancing acts and there are other countervailing things like the market or the bureaucracy or the risk or whatever, we have to give more weight to why we're here, to our mission, what our board of trustees is supposed to be safeguarding, which is better care for patients. We're a healthcare organization.
But everybody says patients first.
Mhm.
And then go on to say, and here's how that value is best maximized. And in turn, you have disagreements about that. So I'm flummoxed. I don't want to get into not here. I mean, I'll talk about anything, but I don't want to get into a possible corner where we're talking about motives and dishonesty. Oh, well, people are just mouthing patients first. They really don't mean it. No, let's say they mean it. But that there are many or seen as being many roads to this end. But actually, I only see one road to this end, and it's the road that I'm proposing, where somebody else says, "Well, no, that's help me to to figure out how saying and believing patients first gets us out of this quandary."
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think I think that someone in the chat put, it's this organizational hypocrisy when some organizations say, "Oh yeah, we're patients first," but we've just decided to save money. We're across our whole health system. We're only going to have one unit doing this, so the patients have to get on transportation across town much more inconveniently than they used to get that kind of care in our health system, because it's going to cut out, some extra costs for us. And, there would always be an explanatory model, which comes back to no margin, no mission. If we don't do that, we can't give care to anybody. And it's like, but is that true? So, to me, there's the question of transparency at that point, much more than anything else. When you see someone saying, "Oh yeah, we believe in patients first," and then you see them doing things that seem to not be helping the patients, it's like what a lot is going on in this country today. Can we try to get some actual facts and data and reality check in the mail, to have a real conversation about whether this is putting patients first? I don't know, Lauren, you looked like you had something.
Well, I was the one that volunteered this language of organizational hypocrisy. And I guess my other point would just be to
Oh,
say,
okay.
it's okay. Um, none of these terms, organizational professionalism, organizational integrity, organizational hypocrisy, are going to be perfectly bounded labels, meaning I think whether or not an organizational behavior or an individual behavior is a violation of professionalism or integrity standards will almost always be a potentially contested proposition. Meaning, Ed, you could say, look at that, what hypocrisy. And I could say, that's not hypocrisy. They're doing patients first for such and such reasons. But I think that's okay. That doesn't mean that the term isn't helping us have a different kind of discussion, maybe, than we're having now. Because right now, I especially feel when we think about organizations behaving in the marketplace, like hiring debt collectors to go after patients, using charge master pricing on patients they know to be vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. We just don't have a language to talk about what people widely agree is at least sort of bad behavior. And we're grasping for some piece of vocabulary. So that's why I really appreciate today's discussion, because organizational professionalism would be one way to kind of go at this and give people a vocabulary to talk about it. Doesn't mean you and I will always agree on what kinds of behaviors are violations of professionalism, but we could at least have some common framework against which to compare empirical facts, as you were saying. Organizational integrity might give us a slightly different kind of framework to do that. But I don't think we should judge the usefulness of the language or the framework or the definition by, does it get us 100%, like error-free agreement. It just needs to help us sort of narrow the bounds of conversation and in some ways make, this is my own view, a little bit more pointed of a critique.
I think with that, we will start to wrap up. I wondered, Fred, if there are any closing thoughts that you have for us.
No. Lauren's, I wish I could stay with the no and then keep my mouth shut and just play that out. But Lauren's last remark made me think about the second index, excuse me, the second triangle question, which I'd never asked before, and there's always a risk because I don't know what's going to happen. How are people going to both view and react to the question? But it posited, at least within the frame of organizational professionalism, of creating the perfect workspace. And did that get us to the professionalism promised land? And there were some folks that, now that I'm looking at it right now, said, yeah, it gets us pretty close. But for the most part, folks in the audience said, gets us somewhere, but not all the way. And so what are those countervailing logics or forces or the like And now Lauren's challenge of do we need a better vocabulary? Because we asked the question. We've created the perfect environment where you can be the professional you want to be. Sorry about the tone of my voice. You know, you can be all you can be. But it didn't get us to the promised land. There's still folks, members of the of our session today didn't see it getting us there, and I want to think a lot more about why not. And perhaps it's because the concept is flawed. I'll stop there. I can't. I do want to end by thanking you. I thanked you at the beginning for all of the wonderful conversations we had before the session. They were truly thought-provoking and thought-framing. And I want to thank Ed and Lauren likewise. And it was so nice, I'd say to the audience, the last time I saw Ed, he was standing up on center stage, graduation 2013 in Harvard Yard, handing out diplomas to graduating members of the medical school. And I got to nudge my wife and say, that was the guy that offered me the job at the University of Rochester way back when. I had to say that. Sorry, Ed.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Fred, for bringing us through this, Lauren and Ed for your comments, and Nathaniel for making it all.
Yes, Nathaniel, thank you.
And I think from the perspective of this series, I can just say to even make legible a kind of question, like, was that organization's behavior professional or unprofessional? I think is a completely, it's a novel contribution, right? It's something we can turn over in our minds, and how we answer it might reflect a lot of our prior beliefs, and it might also reflect whether we're likely to think boldly, right, about what kinds of standards we want to construct for the, yes, individuals, but also the organizations that purport to serve our health. So with all of that said, I'm so grateful to everyone for sticking with us, and we'll hope to see you again. Have a lovely afternoon and weekend. Bye all.